beginning. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our session of honoring women elevating the works of New England architects. I'm Lee Schoberth, Senior Preservation Services Manager from Historic New England, and I'm joined by my colleague Jen Robinson, who will help be moderating our Q&A session, and Rachel Robinson, Director of Preservation at Providence Preservation Society. So we will have a few minutes for questions at the end, but you can submit those in the Q&A section at any time during the presentation. So once architecture programs like MIT and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris began admitting women in the 1890s, more women were able to study architecture, open their own offices, hire other women, and receive private commissions. Despite limitations, by 1920, more than 200 women were practicing architecture in the United States, designing thousands of buildings before they were even allowed to vote. These women were trailblazers in the field, opening doors for future generations of architects. While the centennial anniversary of women's rights to vote last year brought stories of women's contributions to the forefront, efforts to document women in the field of architecture has been ongoing, but is far from complete. The Beverly Willis practiced architecture for 25 years, but she was dismayed at the lack of representation of women in architectural history. The Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation was formed in 2002 with the mission of advancing the knowledge and recognition of women's contributions in architecture. There are some amazing resources on their website documenting pioneering women in architecture, in American architecture. There's also the International Archive of Women in Architecture, which was established in 1985 at Virginia Tech. It started as a joint program between the College of Architecture and Urban Studies and the university libraries, with the goal of creating a resource to document the history of women's contributions in architecture, landscape architecture, architectural history, and urban planning. But there are also a few newer efforts like womenarchitecture.com. This is an initiative led by Rhode Island School of Design, also known as RISD, a faculty member, Hansi Better-Barraza. And that has developed as a resource that focuses on queer and women of color in architecture. It is another great resource to learn some names and become familiar. And then finally, the first American Women Architects book by Sarah Albrecht was published in 2008, and this provides biographical sketches for over 50 American women, starting in architecture before the 1920s. So these are 4 resources that really, if you're looking to kind of get introduced to more women in the field, they've got wonderful biographical sketches and more information about women in architecture. So today, Rachel and I will be introducing you to several pioneering New England architects working in the late 19th and early 20th century. So we'll look at Lois Lilley Howe, Eleanor Manning O'Connor, Eleanor Raymond, Margaret Burnham Geddes, and Frances Henley. We will explore how they influenced architecture through innovative designs and planning, education buildings, undertook sensitive renovation projects, and executed modernist designs. But they also tackled issues like affordable housing and sustainable design while navigating a male-dominated profession. But we'll also examine additional layers of sexuality, social causes, and stories of support. While Lois Lilley Howe is among the better documented early women architects, her path to architecture parallels many early women architects. Despite growing up in the intellectual circles of Boston, Howe's interest in a career in architecture was still radical in the late 19th century. While New England upper-class women were encouraged to pursue a serious interest, it was as a hobby or through volunteering, not as a career. Howe wrote an MIT technology review in 1963. Always interested in houses, I had wanted to be an architect, but had been suppressed by my pastors and masters on the ground that I could not be an architect because I was a woman. But her passion for architecture began at an early age and only grew stronger as she got older. During the construction of the high Victorian Gothic building, Memorial Hall at Harvard University in 1870, she was just 6 years old when this began. And the construction site was across from Howe's childhood home, now the site of the Harvard Science Center. But watching the building take shape spurred her fascination and determination to pursue architecture. Following the death of her father in 1887, Howe's mother decided to sell the house near Memorial Hall and build a smaller one on Appleton Street in Cambridge. Although a tragedy for the family, this turned to be a serendipitous moment for Howe in two ways. First, she had the opportunity to impress architect Robert Swain Peabody of the Boston firm Peabody and Stearns, and they were known for their designs of summer cottages like the original Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, which was destroyed by fire in 1892. Peabody's brother and his sister-in-law were the buyers of the Howe's Cambridge house, and Howe impressed the architect and family friend Robert Peabody by providing a solution to reconfigure a staircase at the Appleton Street house, even after he had declared it impossible. So this and the experience on site of the construction of the Howe's new house on Appleton Street solidified her decision to pursue architecture. And Peabody would remain a supporter of Howe's pursuit of architecture. He later encouraged her to submit designs for the Chicago's World's Fair, and also nominated her to the American Institute of Architects. In 1901, she became the second woman to be elected after Lois Blanchard Bethune. So sometimes as we dive into the life of one woman architect, we find connections to other women working in the field. In 1887, Howe had petitioned the president of MIT to allow her to complete a partial course in architecture, a two-year program. Howe wrote in the 1963 for the Proceedings of the Cambridge Historical Society Oral History, "I was the only girl in the class of 65 men and one of only 2 girls in the drafting room of 90. The other girl was Sophia Haydem. She was ahead of me in class." So Haydem and Howe both graduated from their respective programs in 1890, becoming the first women to graduate from the MIT architecture program. So for those who may be familiar with the architecture of the World's Columbian Exhibition in 1893, you may recognize Haydem's name. Her design won the National Design Competition for the Women's Building at Chicago World's Fair and was constructed, while Howe, who had also submitted a design encouraged by Peabody, received second place and a $500 prize. And she used the money to partially pay for a grand tour in Europe the following year. Among Howe's first commissions was the Potter House for friend and client Alfred C. Potter. Howe's family's social connections were important in her early on as she developed her reputation as an architect and built a client base. Like many of Howe's early commissions, the Potter House is a larger family home with classical details. It was for a wealthier client and includes separate circulation and rooms to accommodate live-in servants. Later, especially following World War I, we will see design shifts as the client base and program requirements of a house change, but her classical inspiration and thoughtful design will persist. But Howe's impact on architecture was not limited to new construction. Around the turn of the 20th century, efforts to preserve and protect the region's architectural heritage was taking hold. In 1910, Historic New England, then known as the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, was founded by William Sumner Appleton. And 2 years later, Howe was among individuals helping to coordinate raising funds to purchase and preserve the Cooper Frost Austin House in Cambridge, Mass. From the beginning of Howe's architectural career, she placed an emphasis on history and detail, and she traveled extensively throughout New England, documenting buildings and architectural details through photographs and measured drawings. Among her travels, she visited one of historic New England sites, Hamilton House in South Berwick, Maine. And a lot of this documentation really helped inform her, kind of classical inspired designs. She was working in the colonial revival style at the time, and also her sensitive renovation projects. So Howe had first opened a firm on Tremont Street in Boston, originally with 2 male partners, but by the end of the year, they had left her high and dry. Howe stated it was one of the best things that had ever happened. Undeterred, she pushed forward, and she went on to found Boston's first and one of the country's earliest all-female architecture firms. So one of the challenges for this generation of women was professional isolation. Without a network of other women in the field, many individual practitioners struggled to gain respect and recognition. But Howe created a place for women architects, a place where they could be supported and thrived. She eventually took on 2 partners, Eleanor Manning in 1913 and Mary Elmay in 1926. So Lois Lilley Howe's first partner in the firm, Eleanor Manning, brought her social conscience. Manning advocated for women's causes and better housing options through her role in several organizations and associations. Manning graduated from MIT 26 years after Lois Lilley Howe and Sophia Haydem in 1906, and she joined the firm in 1908, working as a drafter before becoming a partner in 1913. So Manning also was an advocate for garden cities. This was an ideal planned residential community based on an English model that combined amenities of urban life and with rural access to nature. In 1924, she got the opportunity to work on a planned garden community. She and Howe were among one of 26 firms that was hired to design new houses in a 420-acre planned community in Marymount, Ohio. So this planned community included architect-designed affordable houses, a network of parks, streets, and other neighborhood amenities like a church and residential facilities. In the post-World War I era, architects and planners were met with housing shortages, decreasing family size, fewer live-in servants, and shifting economics. So housing demands shifted, and Howe and Manning maintained their standards of design, but adapted to their clients' needs and budgets. So this community was developed for middle-class families, and here are showing 2 of the examples designed by Howe and Manning. So there's one is a duplex, the other one is a single-family home. While researching women architects in the early 20th century, it's common to see their projects focused on residential architecture. Manning's interest in providing good housing design for all clients brought a broader range of residential commissions to the firm. Manning represented the firm in a collaborative effort known as the 17 Associated Architects, who designed Old Harbor Village, also known as the Mary Ellen McCormick Housing Development in Boston. This was constructed in 1937, and the development was the first public housing project in Boston and one of the earliest in the country. So unlike most affordable housing developments, it wasn't a stark characterless tower, but was instead constructed of kind of townhouses and 3-story apartments with cul-de-sacs and gardens and walkways. And again, even through this affordable housing project, we're seeing those classical detailing, kind of lasting materials and that sense of home and place that we see in a lot of Howe and Manning's work. So in 1931, Eleanor Manning married Johnson O'Connor. O'Connor was the founder of the Human Engineering Laboratory and Johnson O'Connor Research Foundation. His work centered on the scientific study or human abilities or aptitudes. O'Connor believed that everyone has natural talents and that they should be nurtured and used without regard to gender. And so Eleanor worked closely with the foundation. She encouraged women with aptitudes for careers in engineering and architecture and medicine to go out and pursue those occupations that were traditionally held by men. She really wanted to encourage women to realize their full potential. She also lectured at Simmons College, a private women's university in Boston, as an instructor in architecture and housing for over 50 years. So the firm disbanded in 1937 when Howe retired at the age of 73. During its 40 years, the firm was involved in over 400 commissions, predominantly single-family residential designs. So next we're going to look at Eleanor Raymond, another Cambridge native. Her long career spanned 50 years with 200 primarily residential commissions. And her designs included sensitive historical renovations as well as modern residential designs that embrace new materials and push technological advancements in architecture. So Raymond had sought an opportunity to continue her studies in landscape architecture following her graduation from Wellesley College. She found her place at the Cambridge School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture for Women in 1916. That was just 1 year after its informal start. So the Cambridge School provided women with a unique opportunity to receive academic training in architecture and landscape architecture in an all-female environment at a time when Harvard's graduate program did not admit women. And although the program really focused on residential design and gardens, from Raymond's quote here, we get the sense that despite the limitations of study, the Cambridge School created professional opportunities for women that generations before could not have imagined. So Raymond began her career as a draftsperson in Henry Frost's office. He was one of the founders of Cambridge School, but upon her, she was the Frost's sole partner, and they worked on a lot of partnerships with a lot of houses they were designing at the height of that post-World War I housing shortage. And so their firm was advertising commissions that included houses, gardens, interior furnishings. So we're still seeing that kind of residential work coming through in Eleanor Raymond's as well. And here we have the James Cleves house in Winchester, Mass, sorry. So Raymond retained her position with Frost until she opened her own firm in Boston in 1928. Through the introduction to several of Raymond's solo projects, we're going to start to see the kind of breadth of her architectural design, her experimentations with building materials, sustainable technologies, but there's also the supportive role of other women played through collaborations and clients. In 1920s, when Boston city officials decided to widen Charles Street on Beacon Hill, about 10 feet was sliced off the front of buildings to accommodate the widening. So one of these buildings was the future residence, 112 Charles Street. And so Raymond purchased the townhouse, undertook renovations and restoration, and she brought a sensitive preservation approach that rivals today's adaptive reuse standards. But she also met the kind of unique set of needs of the occupants. So she provided both home and office space for 5 professional women. So it was herself, her sister, Rachel Raymond, an interior designer, her lifelong partner, Ethel Powers. She was the editor of House Beautiful. Mary Cummings was a landscape architect, and her sister, Florence Cunningham, was the founder of the Little Theater in Rocky Neck, Massachusetts. And also this was the home of both Eleanor and Rachel's mother as well. So 6 women living in this renovated space at 112 Charles Street. So on a few projects, we see a collaborative effort between the women of Charles Street residents. Here is Dorothy Ellis's High Spruces in Haydem, Connecticut. Raymond designed the architectural renovations with the help of her sister on the interior design, while Mary Cunningham tackled the landscape, and Ethel Powers showcased this project as editor in House Beautiful. So Ethel Powers was, for several decades, was the editor of House Beautiful. She had an inconspicuous role in promoting and supporting women architects. Kind of through the articles, she brought attention to the works of her lifelong companion Raymond, but also other graduates from the Cambridge School program. So Rachel Raymond, Eleanor's sister, worked with her as an interior designer on projects, but she was also a client when she allowed Eleanor to design her new house. This was after Eleanor's trip to Europe, where she was seeing a lot of the modernist style, but here she brought kind of a New England materials and approach to this modernist style that's usually stark white, so we see a lot of texture and color in Raymond's work here. And while the residents of Charles Street created an amazing all-women team, women also played an important role in supporting women architects as clients. And Amelia Peabody Raymond designed over 13 projects. The sculptor and philanthropist provided land and funding for not only Eleanor Raymond's most innovative designs, but she also encouraged her exploration in materials and style. So we have her Sculptor Studio. This was a functional space with specific demands, but Rachel brought, I know I keep saying Rachel, maybe it's because Rachel's joining us and I keep getting the Rachel Raymond. Eleanor brought her own style through details like the jade green doors, the railings, and the placements of Peabody's dog sculptures. But this Raymond wrote, "I believe I must take the owner's desires and make them beautiful." So here we have both what kind of beautiful elements of architecture, but also a very functional space for cleanup and lighting for a sculptor studio. One of her material explorations with Amelia Peabody was the plywood house. While plywood was first patented in 1865 in the United States, production of standardized 4x8 sheet as a building material was not until 1928. And so the exterior of the plywood house was made with these standardized panels in 1940. Raymond's best known design is the Dover Sun House. She worked with MIT engineer Maria Telks to design the experimental house using new solar technology with the hope to meet 100% of the heat demand. The storage device was not water, but was rather Glauber salts. It's spelled Glauber, just in case I'm pronouncing that wrong. But the idea was that these panels that you see here in the diagram, these are the same panels that are on the second floor. As these warmed up with the sun, it would melt the salts, and the fans would circulate the air around the Glauber salts, and this was the way that they heated the house. It also powered it. It did not prove totally successful, and the experiment ended in 1953. But what's unique about this is it was a house with multiple rooms, as well as it had a family actually living there during the experiment. From when Raymond first opened her office in 1928 through the 1970s, she designed and executed over 200 projects. Her designs range from utilitarian structures like a piggery to the technologically innovative sun house. Unfortunately, the underrepresentation and appreciation for her works and other women, we frequently see and hear about stories of demolition. And so I know the Rachel Raymond house and the Sun house were both lost. But nevertheless, her contributions are significant, and those that remain enrich and enliven the social and architectural history of the region. So as I dug into the works of Lois Lilley Howe, Eleanor Raymond, and Eleanor Manning O'Connor, I uncovered more than just works of architecture. Through these women, I found stories of opportunities and challenges, kind of parallels between, even as we're looking at different generations of women in the field, their role of preservation in their careers, the importance of women as a designer, the client, the promoter, and also they were addressing social causes like affordable housing and sustainable design. So the stories go beyond just the buildings to what these women were accomplishing through the work that they were doing. Thank you. And so I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Rachel.
Great, thank you, Lee. Let me quickly share my screen here. Hello to all my neighbors to the north. I'm coming to you live from Providence, Rhode Island this morning, and so pleased to be here. So I'm quickly going to introduce you to two Providence-bred early women architects. And the first is Frances Evelyn Henley. She was the first woman to complete the full course of architecture at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, graduating in 1897 with honors. She was the first woman to practice independently, that means under her own name, in Rhode Island and possibly in New England. And we have Frances's papers are held by the Rhode Island Historical Society, but we also have these examples of her student work from RISD, featured in the RISD catalog of 1895. I think we see definite influence of the arts and crafts movement, particularly in her wallpaper sample on the left there. And later, Frances recalled a conversation she had with one of her professors after noticing that the boys had been receiving more constructural education. She said, when I requested that I be given the complete course, he said, "Oh, I thought you would want the pretty part only." Such was the attitude of man toward woman when I began my study of architecture, as well as when I began to practice. So in reading some of Frances's own words, I get the strong sense that she was well aware of what she was facing as an early woman architect, both as a student and in her practice. She started her practice here on this building in the center. The polychrome brick and stone building must have been a hive of architectural activity. Early on, she was associated with two men in the field, Franklin Sawtell, notice that he died in 1911, and also Arthur Almy. I found a quote that says, after Almy's death in 1924, Frances inherited his business with the condition that she would remain unmarried. And I certainly can't speak to what Almy was thinking, if this was misguided prejudice or sexism, but Frances was a lesbian, so she could not have married her partner if she had wanted to. And here we have the Wheeler School, which many of you may know, on the east side of Providence. In the 1976 National Register nomination, it discredited to Franklin Sawtell, who died 2 years earlier. He certainly received the commission for this first purpose-built school at Wheeler, which, by the way, was established by a woman, Mary C. Wheeler. But Frances, after Franklin's death, Frances went on to complete the work and continued to have the Wheeler School as a client. Now, any look into Frances Henley, you will stumble across this handsome rendering with the plan in the upper left. I found this early on, but was unable, lacking an address, was unable to find out where it was. I had the good fortune to reach out to Amy Barlow, who is a librarian at Rhode Island College, to see if she knew anything about Frances and Margaret. And she said, yes, I actually do know something about Frances because my mother grew up in a house that she designed. And Amy replied with this same image. So Amy was able to confirm that the house was built and survives. Kinstonholm was the name of the surnames of the first owners who commissioned the house, and it survives down in Warwick. There was a nice Sunday paper spread of this house, going room by room in a very detailed fashion, describing all the conveniences. We see Frances there in the bottom left in her Titanic era finery. And even though it's grainy, if you can look at the central image of the living room, we have some bespoke wicker furniture. We have the all but compulsory spinning wheels. I see two that you had to have if you were, showing any deference to your American colonial heritage. And you can just make out the ingle nook there with a bench and the fireplace. And the paper went to links to point out that this was a woman architect, and she was able to satisfy the feminine demand for closets and dustless devices in a unique bungalow. So here is a photo of the house from Amy's family archives. And here we have some wonderful photos showing family members in front of and inside the bungalow. Here behind the family bride, we can see an up close of that ingle nook. Again, noticing the bench on the right and the fireplace with the Roman brick, which is thin yellow Roman brick that Frances picked out herself. Now, after I did a previous talk about Frances, I was immediately contacted by a woman who just purchased this property, which I featured briefly in that other talk. And she invited me and some colleagues down for a visit because she said, I live in Frances's home. Frances designed this house for a client, Mr. Allen, in 1919, but then bought it and moved in herself and spent her last 25 years here. This is located in the Patuxent Village, Patuxent Neck area of Cranston, right on the Narragansett Bay. Beautiful. There's the new owner's dog there at the bottom on the porch. And they have a copy of plans and elevations for the house. I don't believe it goes back to 1919 with the original plans, but certainly showing us the work that Frances did. She continued to fiddle with the house, making it her own, adjusting some of the circulation inside the house. And although this is difficult to see in this format, this is a brilliant and I think unique example of the floor plan and changes that Frances has made structurally to the house, but also her pattern for the furniture placement and even little area rugs. So just a great reminder of this being not only the woman's home, but a female architect designing her own place. Now, the inset here was a photo I found in a real estate listing before the current owners purchased the house. And it was described as a rose window, which confused me because, as we all know, rose windows are the large round windows found at the end of churches. But once I went inside this house, I was able to notice right away that it's rose pink. So this rose window and the dormer above were adjustments that Frances made when she was making the house her own. And here are a few more details from the inside. I assume we can credit Frances with these design decisions and details. We might even be looking at her own handwriting there. There were plenty of tags left over in the basement. Do note on the right, we have a Dutch door, which I assume is an influence of McKinmead and White's shingle style work in both Newport and Narragansett. Frances passed away in 1955. And I suspect she had a great deal to do with how her memory and legacy would be remembered. We have a quote directly from her on the bottom left. When I first went into the business, there seemed to be an unwillingness on the part of some of the public to call me an architect. Even the directory man wanted to put me down as an architectress. So here today in 2021, as we are reconsidering some gendered terms that are used, I suspect we can thank Frances and her early peers to make sure that architect could be gender neutral, and we do not have architectresses today. All right, now the baby of our group is Margaret Kelly Geddes. She was born in Illinois and relocated to Providence with her family when her mother remarried, attending and graduating from the Wheeler School, which of course Frances designed. She then went on to Vassar College and was a lifelong active alumna. And then she received a second bachelor's at MIT in the class of 1933 in architecture, one of three women in that class. Her MIT thesis was an unbuilt beach development for Narragansett that survives in the MIT library. And not long into her career, she went down to Washington to do her bit in World War II, working both for the Federal Public Housing Authority and driving an Army truck. Now, at some point, she met up with Peter Gettys, who was also an architect, graduating from Columbia in 1926. They married during the war. And as you will see, most of the practice, early on at least, was primarily residential architecture in southeastern New England. All right, now it took great lengths to try to find a picture of Margaret, but we finally have two examples thanks to Vassar and their alumni department. So here we have Margaret on the left as a senior in 1929, and she is on the left of the picture on the right as an active alumna in Rhode Island. And I didn't wear my pearl earrings today in honor of Margaret. Now, none of the women, I believe, should be defined by the men in their lives. However, it is notable that Margaret's maternal grandfather was Daniel Burnham of the World's Columbian Exposition, as we've seen already. Chicago, the City Beautiful movement, the plan for Washington, D.C. So she certainly had planning and architecture in her DNA. I've seen that the Burnham family reunions have been described as AIA conventions, and her brother, Burnham Kelly, was the longtime dean of the School of Architecture, Art, and Planning at Cornell. This house on the east side of Providence is where Margaret spent a lot of her time while a student and then prior to getting married to Peter. And these are two buildings associated with Peter and Margaret's practice. They had offices in both the Rhode Island Hospital Trust Company building downtown, the one on the left, which is today a fantastic adaptive reuse into the RISD Library in the banking hall with student housing above. And then the apple of my eye, the Industrial Trust Building, AKA the Superman Building. I hope you all know about it. It has stood vacant for 8 years. It turns 93 next Friday, and we are advocating for its reuse. Still the tallest building in Rhode Island. The arrows here are approximate to where their offices might have been located. Now, not too long ago, I discovered a great resource for looking into architects, American architects in the middle of the 20th century through the AIA, American Institute of Architects national website. And we have this very detailed, though abbreviated, listing of Margaret's activities and some of her commissions. I don't know if Peter have been bothered to turn something in, but at least we have a good reference of Margaret's professional and volunteer activities. And the next two here are going to be two houses in Massachusetts. I've been unable to confirm if they survive. So since I'm speaking to a Massachusetts audience, if you know anything about these next two houses, please do let me know. I tried to track them down in Sturbridge. And then the next one as well. This one I just realized reminds me a little bit of Rachel Raymond's design. So this is something Margaret and Peter did. These drawings are not in their own hand, I don't believe. This was a feature of 81 new houses for Architectural Forum in April of 1941. And I think what we're seeing, as Lee alluded to, is at this moment, prior to World War II, in the academy, there's the classicism and then this modernism is sneaking in, coming over from Europe. And so we're finding this slimlined, austere, compact design, but in New England vernacular brick and other materials. And so that's what we find with Margaret and Peter's work. Here's another example, a much larger house. So if there are any Brookfield folks out there, please let me know if this house survives. The George Rowland house. Here we have the flower room, and you can see the quite large footprint of the building. And there's the flower room in plan. Back in Providence, here's Margaret and Peter's own home. You can, if you know the east side of Providence, we are chock-a-block full of huge Victorian, late Victorian, colonial revival homes. And so this must have been quite the stark intrusion in a good way of something new, their own home on Manning Street. But it still does have some references like the modillions to all the classical elements around it. Sadly, this house does not exist. It was demolished by Brown University to make room for a new building. Let the record show I did not live in Providence yet, and so could not be here to protest. But there is a road tour. This is an online effort by several public history and public humanities organizations. So I invite you to look up both Frances and Margaret. They have entries in the road tour, so you can see more about Margaret and Peter's own home. If we walk across Hope Street and continue on Manning, we find two examples that survive, I will tell you. These were done, that wall indicates an estate, and the mansion, the Victorian mansion, was demolished by the children who inherited it and built these two modern houses as investment properties. So this first one from 1940, I'm happy to say, is one of our earliest PPS historic marker houses. I'm sorry, one of the youngest houses to have a PPS marker. So although this is 80 years and has its own patina now, considering all the colonial and Victorian architecture we have in Providence, this is one of the babies in terms of architectural pedigree. And its next door neighbor and sister house, fronts Hope Street. This is owned by a PPS trustee and friend of mine. These are the real estate photos from before she bought the house, but I hope you can get the sense inside of some of the proportions, that cozy but clean lines. It reminds me of the Gropius house in Lincoln, which I hope many of you have toured. The owner inherited plans and these very detailed specs for the house. And so we were able to look at those together, and I've highlighted Margaret and Peter's stamp for you. And as you can see, they were working out of the Hospital Trust Company building at this time. And there's nothing better than Margaret's own words. Most of my interest and activities are centered in my community of Providence and Rhode Island. Planning, and that includes physical, social, fiscal, and legislative planning, is the area which fascinates me. And I try to stay close to it, whether employed or not. So that gives us a great sense of her personal philosophy. And I thought I'd end with a building where, once again, Margaret and Frances may have crossed paths. I've already mentioned that Margaret graduated from the Wheeler School, which Frances designed. Here's another building. This is downtown. The Providence Plantations Club was a women's club. Frances did not receive the commission for the building. That was done by a Boston firm, but she did receive the commission for several interiors. These are not in her own hand, but give us a sense, of the feminine decor. And Margaret was a one-time member, so they may have crossed paths at the Providence Plantations Club. And with that, oh, and there's a road tour for this as well. So again, lots of good stuff if you'd like to learn more about these women or other Providence and Rhode Island stories. With that, I'd like to thank all of these folks and institutions who helped me out. And I will stop sharing. Please do email me if you have any links to Margaret or Frances. And now I will join my colleagues.
Excellent. Great job, both Lee and Rachel. If anyone has any additional questions, now's your chance. We have about 5 minutes left for Q&A, but I'd like to begin with one of questions that we've received, which involves sort of archival research, or through your research, have you found any letters or documentation that reveals sort of interactions between contractors and architects, sort of contractors' perceptions about maybe working with women architects at the time, which may have been unusual for some? Could you speak to that maybe?
So I know, Rachel and I both kind of dove into this more recently, that we've started to kind of really dig into these women. And I know since my research has begun, the real kind of meat of resources is the MIT and Harvard archives. And since I started this, both of those have been closed. So a lot of my research has been secondary sources. So I haven't come across any kind of direct, letters or anything that talks about them with contractors, but I think we can kind of get a sense from all of them and some of the questions that they were getting from either their peers or the people that they were working with, or how they were, trying to be recognized as an architress, that I'm sure there were some challenges that when they were working with contractors, but I haven't had the chance to dive into those archives to see if we have any of those resources and kind of quotes and words from them. But we know they were kind of pushing the boundaries of this male-dominated profession at the time. So I expect that there had been kind of those pressures and those challenges that they were facing.
Yeah, I mean, you can read between the lines of the papers, the contemporary newspaper articles, the features about the houses. I think everybody was well aware that this was maybe not shocking, but unusual that there were women architects designing houses. Frances's diary is held at the Rhode Island Historical Society. I've not, for the same reason, I've not had a chance to read into that, but we do have speeches and quotes in newspapers. And so those are the sources I've used as well. And I see one question I want to address, Jen, is the suffrage movement. I can tell you that Margaret was very proud to be involved with the League of Women Voters in Rhode Island for a long time. But again, she's our baby of the group. So she came up with the right to vote.
I didn't come across anything with, with Lois Lilley Howe or Eleanor Manning and the resources. It wasn't something that came up, but they were, working at that time. And so there is possible that there is some political activity that I just haven't uncovered yet in their histories. But I know that they were both working and supporting women in other ways. So it's very possible that they had friends or colleagues that were also, tied with the movement.
Excellent. And we have just one more question, which hopefully is quick to answer, which is when did MIT start taking in women architects in their program?
Yeah, so I tried to dig into that myself, kind of wondering the same thing, but I wasn't able to find. What I can assume is that Sophia Haydem, if she was in a 4-year program, she would have been starting in 1886. So I think she may have been the first one. At MIT, classes began in 1865, and kind of overall, the first woman that started taking classes there was Ellen Swallow, and that was in 1882. And so she was the first woman to be taking classes at MIT, but she was studying chemistry and not architecture. But I'm assuming that kind of Sophia Haydem would have been that first one starting in the architecture program at 1886. And then, Lois Lilley Howe following her.
Great. Excellent. Well, it looks like we are just in time to wrap up. Thanks everyone for attending this session. If you have any questions additional, I'm sure you can forward them to Lee and Rachel. And with that, we will close so everyone can get to their next session. Thank you, everybody.